Welcome to this online lesson called Guns or Butter? Did Germany plan on war by 1939? The aims today are to know how the Nazis changed their economy to prepare for war. The economy relates to anything to do with work and money and trade, things like that. To explain how life changed for workers, and to evaluate how prepared for war Germany was in 1939. A quick do now task. This is Nazi economics minister Hermann Goering, just one of the many jobs that he had in Hitler's government. What does this photo suggest about his personality? You can't get this wrong, but if you do know anything about Hermann Goering in advance, then do use that knowledge. If not, see what you can infer from this picture. Don't spend long on this, just a minute or two will be fine. Pause the video while you complete this. Perhaps you've picked up on Goering's, shall we say, fascination for medals and quite ostentatious or posh military uniforms. He was a very vain man, but let's find out a little bit more about him. New subheading: Hermann Goering. A miniature history. Hermann Goering fought in World War I as a fighter pilot, becoming a famous ace. He was awarded Germany's highest award in World War I, the Ordre pour le Mérite. He often wore this on his uniforms. He joined the Nazi Party in the early 1920s, before it had any chance of real power. He also took part in Hitler's attempt to take power by force in 1923, the so-called Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. It was a massive failure. Indeed, Goering was wounded in the groin in the putsch and became addicted to morphine painkillers, making his mood swing between charming and jolly, boastful and furiously angry. He was a very difficult person to understand and predict. It also made his weight balloon, as you can see. He was put in charge of the economy, so money and businesses, in 1935. He was also made the head of the Luftwaffe. This is the German Air Force that was rebuilt in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. He liked designing ever more elaborate uniforms for himself. He was second in command to Hitler for most of World War II. And he also built himself a luxurious hunting lodge in Germany. If that wasn't enough, he owned possibly the world's largest train set, including miniature Luftwaffe planes that would fly around it. Perhaps he's just like a big kid, only a very evil one. Some follow-up tasks. Which fact do you find most surprising? Bear in mind, this might not be the one that's the most historically significant. Next, which 2 to 3 facts best explain his role in Nazi Germany? Note these down. This will help you understand his role and help your understanding of who he was. Thirdly, which fact is most important in understanding his role in the Nazi state? You may have already chosen that one as part of part 2, but do explain why it's most useful or most important in helping understand his role in the Nazi state. What was it that he was really doing for Hitler and the Nazis? It'll take you about 5 or 6 minutes probably to do those tasks, maybe a little bit longer, so pause the video now while you complete them. Okay, before we move on, some of these facts, like him being shot in the groin or owning the world's largest train set, might be quite surprising and interesting, but they're probably not the ones that are most important for learning his role. But they do help give us a sense of his character. He was a very eccentric and strange man, on top of being an evil and committed Nazi. Guns or butter? In 1935, Hermann Goering, Hitler's economics minister and former World War I fighter ace, launched a crucial new policy. It was called the 5-year plan. The plan stated that Germany should be ready for war by 1940, but as you may know, Germany went to war a little ahead of schedule in 1939. We'll see whether that was a mistake. As part of this plan, Goering decided that Germany needed to, firstly, rebuild its armed forces. This was known as rearmament, and it was against the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. If you're unfamiliar with the Treaty of Versailles, I've done a previous lesson on it with some of my groups, and I'm hopefully going to get a video up about it at some other time. If not, give it a quick search on Google. He also said that Germany needed to become self-sufficient. This means that it no longer relied on other countries to get food and raw materials. For example, Germany had to import a lot of its oil. Hermann Goering hoped that it might become self-sufficient and it wouldn't need to do this anymore, which is crucial if you're going to fight a war. This policy is known by a more posh word called autarky. Goering summed up his plan with the following statement. When asked what was more important to the country, weapons or food, Goering replied, Guns make us strong. Butter only makes us fat. Well, that's kind of paraphrasing what he really said, but the message is kind of there. The irony of this is also not lost on us, Hermann Goering. Some follow-up tasks then. Summarise this information. Firstly, describe Goering's 5-year plan. What did he want to achieve? How is he going to do it? Secondly, explain what autarky means. And thirdly, as an extension, is this plan likely to make life better or worse for German workers? We're going to investigate this in more detail, but have a think about it first and explain your view. This will take you about 10 minutes to do, so pause the video now and answer those questions in full sentences. Pause now. Okay, so for part 1, hopefully we've identified that Germany wants to rearm and rebuild its armed forces and become self-sufficient and not have to rely on other countries. So this would involve actually recreating armed forces such as the Air Force, and it would also involve sourcing raw materials from within Germany or places where Germany was friendly. Okay, what about the next? Autarky. This means being able to kind of look after your own country without having to rely on others. And is this plan likely to make life better or worse for German workers? Well, we'll revisit that, and whatever answer you put, you'll be able to see whether you were right or not. Part 1. Did Germany plan on going to war? Why might Hitler have wanted Germany to go to war? You might remember the shame that many Germans felt at the end of World War I. If they started another war and won it, much of this shame for German people would have been wiped out. Hitler was determined that he would make good on his promise to make Germany a great and powerful nation once again. A war was seen as one way of achieving this. One crucial reason why Hitler wanted to declare another war was his desire to overturn the Treaty of Versailles, which was hated by many German people. We're going to look at it now in more detail using some primary evidence, specifically this source. This source, a poster cartoon, is a cartoon from 1935, the same year that Goering published his 5-year plan. The caption reads, "Hurrah, the butter is here." There's the full translation. "Hurrah, the butter is here. Goering said, iron has always made a nation strong. Butter and lard have only made the people fat." This is a political cartoon by a cartoonist called John Hartfield. Actually, he was a German whose real name was Helmut Herzfeld, but he turned it into the name John Hartfield to fit in with his American audiences. But he worked in Germany before he fled. He specialised, by the way, in creating what we call kind of photo collages. So he's taken photos from elsewhere and sort of stitched them together, a little bit like you might do with something like Photoshop today. But he did it very much with a pair of scissors and glue, the old-fashioned way. There's a lot going on in this picture. Firstly, is it pro-Nazi or anti-Nazi? Secondly, how can you tell? And thirdly, what do you think the message is? Source work can be quite tricky, so study the source carefully before you start answering those questions, and remember to answer in full sentences. Okay, pause the video while you complete that. Hopefully we've identified that this is anti-Nazi. If you thought it was pro-Nazi, you've probably been taken in by the picture of Hitler at the back and the swastikas on the wall. This is meant to show an absurdly Nazi family. So this family supports the Nazis, but the poster doesn't. How do we know that this family supports the Nazis? Well, look, they're prepared to eat bits of metal rather than having actual food. This is obviously a joke. It's ridiculous and it's not true. So it's showing the absurdity of what Goering is saying that iron makes a nation strong, butter and lard only makes them fat. Of course, if you haven't got any food to eat, then you can hardly become a strong nation, can you? So that gives us an idea as to how you can tell, because it is basically a ridiculous picture. And the message, again, it's the idea that it's not really realistic to expect that the nation can become strong just by making metal goods and weapons. They will need to be fed as well. It's worth saying that John Hartfield, or Helmut Herzfeld, fled Nazi Germany before World War II to the United States. Good job for him that he did. This sort of cartoon would very shortly get people into dire trouble in Germany. What about help for the workers? One of the main ways that Hitler was able to gain power was by promising that it would improve the lives of ordinary German workers. However, You may have already discovered in your earlier lessons that trade unions had been banned and replaced by the Nazi-run German Labour Front. This was known as the DAF, or Deutsches Arbeitsfront. Trade unions traditionally represent the power of the workers and make sure that workers can't be exploited by their employers. Obviously, this is a challenge to Hitler's rule because they might disagree with him, so he gets rid of them and replaces them with something else. They made some improvements at work, such as safety, and they also improved lunch breaks. This helped keep the workers on side. DAF units were run like army units and were put to work on building things like motorways, which were known as autobahns in Germany. These massive work programs provided an awful lot of work, but they required a great deal of discipline to be built. The DAF even worked in a uniform, much like the Nazi Party uniform. So we've got an organisation here which is kind of turning the workers into soldiers. What about the next bit? Well, they also set up something called Strength Through Joy, which is Kraft durch Freude. I think I've got the German right there. Sometimes referred to as KDF. They organised leisure activities for workers and their families. This included holidays, concerts, sports fixtures, and keep fit clubs. The opportunity to own a car was also highlighted by KDF. You can see a picture of one of these cars in that poster, the so-called KDF wagon, or the Strength Through Joy wagon. This later became known as the Beetle because of the appearance of the car. And until quite recently, this design was still being built, believe it or not. It was produced by a company, Volkswagen, which means the people's car. So yes, the modern company of Volkswagen has its original origins in Nazi Germany, believe it or not. Let's study the German Labour Front in a little bit more detail first of all. There were certain advantages for the workers of the DAF. They provided work for thousands of people. This was a huge benefit to those people who had lost their jobs in the Great Depression in 1929. Some workers accepted it as a replacement for the trade unions, and it provided new roads and infrastructure for Germany. This was particularly important for moving the army around quickly. Remember that this is kind of geared towards preparing Germany for war. Disadvantages, however. People were forced to work for the DAF if they were unemployed. They didn't have the choice. Most of the jobs were temporary. When the road was completed, the jobs could be lost. It also didn't represent workers like a trade union. It was controlled by the Nazis. It told workers not what to do. It didn't represent what the workers actually wanted. The poster here shows a typical propaganda poster supporting the DAF. Says at the front, Reichsarbeitsdienst, which means basically labour service for the empire, for the country. So, your task then. Firstly, describe the advantages and disadvantages of the DAF for the workers. You're very welcome to summarise those 3 bullet points into a short paragraph. Secondly, do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages for the workers? Explain your point of view here. This is a matter of opinion. You've got to think about what a trade union might do for the workers compared to the German Labour Front. Make your call, decide, and write down your answer in a full sentence. Pause the video while you complete that task. Okay, I'm not going to tell you what your opinion should be, so we're going to move on to the next stage. Add this as another heading now. Strength Through Joy, or KDF. We can see a German poster here, Kraft durch Freude. Basically, it shows Hitler admiring the original designs for the Volkswagen Beetle car. Actually, this poster is not complete. We'll see why not in a moment. The advantages of KDF for the workers were that some people did get holidays. Workplaces had keep fit programs to keep the population healthy. The Volkswagen car was introduced. This was supposed to be a luxury and affordable car. Owning a car at this time was seen as one of the ultimate status symbols. However, there were disadvantages. Few people actually ever went on holiday. It was difficult to save up for them, and there were limited places. Secondly, relatively few people ever bought a Volkswagen. It took so long to save up for one that often by the time people did, the war had started and it was no longer an option. So when World War II came along, virtually all Strength Through Joy programs ended. And this is where I show you the rest of the poster, clearly not produced by the Nazis. It shows at the bottom a dead German soldier, well, a couple of them actually, lying next to another version of the Volkswagen. This is the militarised Kugelwagen version of the Volkswagen car, showing how even this civilian car could be turned over to military uses. Not very nice. So your tasks. Describe the advantages and disadvantages of strength through joy for the workers. And do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages again? Again, explain your view, even if it's the same as it was before. You've got new examples to draw on here. Okay, pause the video while you do that, and we'll move on. Clearly, the Nazis are trying to control every aspect of people's lives here, not just how they behave at work, but also what they do in their leisure time. We return to the point about the Volkswagen Beetle here. The idea being put forward by this poster is that you could save up for a car by simply saving 5 Deutschmarks or Reichsmarks a week. Workers could save for a Beetle car, but the reality, as we've already established, was that many of the times this money actually went elsewhere, and so the factory ended up making tanks and other weapons of war, and not family cars for the people. Oh dear. But this links back into the idea of Germany preparing for war rather than trying to make workers' lives better. Preparing for war. Rearmament. I'm going to show you an example of Germany's rearmament here. It was often quite sneaky. Here's an example of the way that Germany rearmed despite the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. Below is the Dornier Dio 17 in the late 30s, a brand new fast airliner for civilian passengers to go on holiday in. This was linked to the idea of strength through joy and providing holidays for people. It's a very sleek, very modern aircraft for the 1930s. You can just tell that it would have been really, really fast for its time. However, can you also spot a problem? If this is supposed to be a civilian airliner, where do the civilian people actually sit? There's very little room. In fact, it had the nickname Flying Pencil. You can see why it's so skinny, it's got such a pointy nose. Well, this is the answer. It looks good, but it's actually hopeless. Only 6 people could cram aboard, and they were cramped and uncomfortable for the entire journey. But just by coincidence, it could comfortably carry, with a little bit of modification, 1,000 kilograms of bombs and 3 machine guns. Here it is in its military configuration, with a bomb aimer's glass nose, the seats removed, and a twin tail put in place. Several German aircraft were designed as civilian planes in the knowledge that they would make better warplanes. This way that they could argue to people keeping an eye on the Treaty of Versailles that Germany was not rebuilding its air force, it was simply trying to get ahead in civilian aviation. And for the most part, people either ignored the reality or they believed them. So we're going to see the other ways that Germany rearmed now. Below is a table of heads and tails, or at least it will be when I reveal it. The heads are all limitations on the German military from the Treaty of Versailles. The tails are all ways in which the Nazis got around them. Match the heads to the tails by recording them as complete sentences. This might take you a little while, 15 to 20 minutes possibly. However, do read them carefully. All of them should flow together as sentences, and look for key words and clues that might clue you in as to which one matches up with which. Firstly, the limitations. The German army was restricted to 100,000 men. The Germans were only allowed small warships and no submarines. The Germans were not allowed to have an air force. Germany was not allowed to have any troops in the Rhineland area of Germany. The Germans were not allowed any tanks. The new German armies lacked training and war experience. The Allies hoped the Treaty of Versailles would stop German rearmament. Okay, now the tails. They've all been jumbled up, so you will need to resort them. So the German Navy built small, powerful pocket battleships and got the Netherlands to design submarines. A pocket battleship was one that was both powerful but also small. So Hitler ignored the treaty and sent troops there in 1935. But it didn't. By the time Hitler's army stopped being a secret, it was too late to stop it. So Hitler reintroduced conscription, making people serve in the army to make it bigger. So pilots were trained to fly airliners, which could be easily made into bombers, the new air force being established in 1935. So the German army practiced tactics in fake tanks while new ones were being designed. And so Hitler sent some army and air force units to fight in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 and 1939. Okay, we will go through the answers once you finish those, but for now, pause the video while you complete those, and you can make any corrections afterwards. Pause now. Done? Well, let's see whether you've got the answers right. The German army was restricted to 100,000 men. Here we go. So Hitler reintroduced conscription, making people serve in the army to make it bigger. The Germans were only allowed small warships and no submarines. So the German Navy built small, powerful pocket battleships and got the Netherlands to produce submarines. The Germans were not allowed to have an air force. So pilots were trained to fly airliners, which could be easily made into bombers, the new air force being established in 1935. Germany was not allowed to have any troops in the Rhineland area of Germany, so Hitler ignored the treaty and sent troops there in 1935. Incidentally, this was an opportunity that the Allies could have stopped him. They chose not to. The Germans were not allowed any tanks, so the German army practiced in fake tanks. Basically, they put tank appearances on car chassis and just trained them to do that. And they still had things like the radios so that they could pretend that they were firing at each other, and they almost literally were shouting bang instead of firing guns. The new German armies lacked training and war experience, so Hitler sent some army and air force units to fight in the Spanish Civil War. There's little better way of teaching someone how to fight than actually sending them to fight. The Allies hoped that the Treaty of Versailles would stop German rearmament, but it didn't. By the time Hitler's armies stopped being secret, it was too late to stop it, and the Allies simply had to catch up. Okay, make any corrections that you need to, and then we'll move on. Pause the video if you need to. We're going to have a look at how German rearmament was a success for the Nazis, especially early on. Firstly, I've got a photograph here of some Junkers 52 transport aircraft, which were employed as light bombers during something called the Spanish Civil War. We won't go into detail as to what the war was all about, but basically there was the nationalist side, who the Nazis supported because they had similar political ideas, and there was the Republican side on the other side. Those aren't German markings on the side of these German planes, they're Spanish nationalist markings. But believe me, those were not Spanish crews, those were German Luftwaffe Air Force pilots training in war to become more effective when Hitler finally launched World War II. Also, check out the area in red on this map. This shows Germany and the nations that it was able to conquer or take over even before World War II started. In a future lesson we're going to be looking at how this was possible, but we'll skip over that for now. Instead, we'll head straight towards 1939 and the beginning of World War II. These are all the countries that the Nazis invaded early on. Firstly, they invaded Poland in September of 1939. Then in May of 1940, they invaded the Netherlands and Belgium and France. Denmark was also invaded, and Norway. Some tasks then. Which country did Germany use to test its armed forces? And then secondly, list the countries where Germany successfully invaded between 1939 and 1940. If you need to flip the video back and re-watch it so you can get the answers and maybe take some notes as you go along, then by all means do so. If not, pause the video now and write down your answers. All of this means that within a year of World War II starting, and in fact less than a year, German territories, here shown in red, expanded to look more like this. I realise that only half of France is highlighted here. Technically, the southern half of France was still under its own government called the Vichy government, but with one catch. The Vichy government had to do everything that the Nazis told them to, and eventually Hitler would take over all of France. But this is a stunning territorial success for the German armed forces. Clearly, the German rearmament plan had worked. Or had it? Let's remember that Goering's 5-year plan stated that Germany should not only rearm, well they clearly have, but that Germany should be self-sufficient. Spoiler alert, but I'm here to remind you that Germany lost World War II, and thank goodness they did. So clearly the whole plan can't have been an entire success, despite the fact that they've managed to gain so much territory early on. We're going to follow this up with a written task. Describe 2 features of how Germany's economy, this means anything to do with work, business and money, changed under the Nazis. We've seen several examples of this. Remember what we looked at with the DAF and KDF movements, but also Goering's plan with the 5-year plan. Secondly, describe 2 features of how Germany prepared for war in 1939. We've had a look at the way that Germany rearmed. So how to answer? Give 2 relevant examples and explain them, or add an additional detail. So to get 2 marks out of the 4 that you get in for each of these questions, One way that Germany prepared for war was by building airliners that could also operate as bombers. That's your first mark. An example of this was the Dornier Do-17 pictured. That's your second mark. You don't have to choose that one, but that might be how you'd structure the answer, and you can use that as something of a writing frame if you need to. So in a GCSE exam, especially for the Edexcel mark schemes, each one of those questions would be worth about 4 marks when written in that style. I also realised that actually this style of question is not asked by Edexcel for the Germany question for anyone who's revising for the GCSE, but it would reflect a question that you would get in paper 1. So it's just a bit of exam skill and practice. If you're in year 9 or in a lower year group, it is useful to try and learn how to write in this structured way, which will allow you to take some specific examples and add a little bit more detail to them in a fairly straightforward answer. In the real exam, you'd have 6 minutes each to answer these questions, so 12 minutes total. I would say 15 would be plenty if you are a little bit more unfamiliar with these tasks. So without further ado, answer those 2 questions, and you can pause the video now while you do that. Let's finish up. Germany did really well early in World War II. Its armed forces were well trained, brilliantly equipped and daringly led. Here we can see some soldiers who had invaded Russia in 1941. They've stolen a roast chicken and seem to be enjoying it very well. They conquered huge swathes of land. But by 1943 to 44, Germany was suffering shortages of food, manpower and fuel. By 1945, the shortages were crippling Germany, and they lost the war. Do you agree with this statement? Goering remembered Germany's guns, but forgot that the butter was needed too. Here's what I mean by this. Remember that Germany's 5-year plan was supposed to do 2 things. It was supposed to rearm Germany and build up their army, air force and navy again. Well, that clearly seems to have happened. But it was also supposed to make Germany self-sufficient so that they would have enough supplies and food to get through the war. That clearly didn't happen, and that's what I mean by they remembered their guns, but they forgot Germany's butter. Answer whether or not you agree with that question. Pause the video while you do so. And once you've done that, that is the end of the lesson. I'll say thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been useful. I hope it's been interesting to you. If it has, give this video a like and possibly subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much and goodbye.